The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Moore as Private First Class Daniel Reeves hammered a bent nail into the wooden post beside the artillery range. His hands, calloused from weeks of manual labor, worked methodically despite the snickering behind him. "Hey, MacGyver, what's that supposed to be?" Sergeant Mason called out, his voice dripping with mockery. The other artillerymen erupted in laughter, their voices echoing across the dusty training ground. Daniel didn't turn around. "It's a range marker, Sergeant. For wind compensation calculations." With a bent nail, Mason walked closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "We've got laser rangefinders, kid. $1 million equipment. And you're playing with trash." The year was 2019, and Fort Moore's artillery battalion was preparing for deployment to Eastern Europe. Daniel had arrived 3 months earlier, fresh from basic training, his personnel file showing exceptional scores in mathematics and physics. None of that mattered here. What mattered was that he was the youngest, the quietest, and the one who did things differently. Staff Sergeant Torres leaned against the M777 howitzer, cleaning his sunglasses. "Leave him alone, Mason. If the kid wants to waste his time with junk, that's his problem. We've got real work to do." Daniel finally looked up. The bent nail was positioned at a precise angle, its shadow falling across a series of marks he'd carved into the wood. "With respect, Sergeant Torres, this isn't junk. It's a reference point for calculating trajectory adjustments when the digital systems fail." Torres laughed, a harsh bark that scattered a nearby crow. "When do our systems fail, Reeves? This isn't World War II. We've got GPS, ballistic computers, and weather stations. Your grandfather's tricks don't work anymore." Daniel's jaw tightened. His grandfather, Colonel James Reeves, had served in Vietnam. He taught Daniel everything about artillery before Alzheimer's stole his memories. The bent nail method was one of dozens of old-school techniques the colonel had insisted still had value. "Trust your eyes, boy. Technology fails. Math doesn't." But here, at Fort Moore, tradition meant nothing if it looked primitive. Captain Hendricks emerged from the command tent, clipboard in hand. His crisp uniform contrasted sharply with the dust-covered soldiers around him. "All right, listen up. We've got a live-fire exercise in 2 weeks. Battalion command will be watching. I want precision, speed, and professionalism." He paused, his eyes landing on Daniel's wooden post. "Reeves, what is that?" "A supplementary ranging tool, sir." Hendricks walked over, examined the bent nail, then turned to face the assembled unit. "Gentlemen, we are representatives of the most technologically advanced military in human history. We do not use bent nails." He pulled the post from the ground and tossed it aside. "Stick to the equipment you were issued. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Daniel said quietly. The briefing continued, but Daniel barely heard it. He watched his bent nail marker lying in the dirt, its shadow still falling at the precise angle he'd calculated. Around him, his fellow soldiers whispered and chuckled. "The kid and his toys. Thinks he's smarter than the computers. Wait till he freezes up during real fire." That evening, in the barracks, Daniel sat on his bunk reviewing topographical maps of the training range. The live-fire exercise would simulate a counter-battery scenario. Locate and destroy enemy artillery positions before they could fire on friendly forces. Speed and accuracy were everything. Corporal Zhang, one of the few soldiers who didn't openly mock him, sat down nearby. "You really think that nail thing works?" Daniel looked up. "I know it does. My grandfather used it in Vietnam. Saved his battery 3 times when their equipment got knocked out by shrapnel." Zhang nodded slowly. "These guys don't know what to make of you, man. You're too quiet, too different. They think you're trying to show them up. I'm not trying to show anyone up. I'm trying to be ready." "Ready for what?" "For when everything goes wrong." Zhang smiled. "Nothing's going wrong, Reeves. This is training. Everything's controlled." Daniel didn't respond. He returned to his maps, calculating distances, elevations, and wind patterns. Outside, the Georgia night hummed with cicadas. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled. 2 weeks. That's all he had to prove that the old methods still mattered. That his grandfather's wisdom wasn't obsolete. That he belonged here, But first, he had to survive being the outsider, the strange kid with his bent nails and hand-carved markers, in a world that worshipped technology and dismissed anything that looked like the past. The barracks lights flickered off at 2,200 hours. Daniel lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, running calculations in his head. 3 miles. For targets. Variable winds. Electronic countermeasures. The old ways and the new would have to work together. If anyone would listen. The morning of the live fire exercise arrived with an oppressive humidity that made uniforms cling to skin. Daniel reported to his gun crew at 0500 hours, his stomach tight with anticipation. For M777 howitzers stood in formation, their barrels pointed toward the distant range where simulated enemy positions waited. Captain Hendricks gathered the crews around a digital display showing the target area. Intelligence reports indicate 4 enemy gun positions scattered across a 3-mile radius. Your fire control systems have all the data. Acquire, fire, displace. Fast and clean. Battery A will take positions 1 and 2. Battery B handles 3 and 4. Daniel was assigned to Battery B, Gun 3. Sergeant Mason commanded the crew, with Torres overseeing both batteries. As they moved into position, Daniel noticed something odd about the wind. It was shifting erratically, gusting from the southeast then suddenly swirling from the west. Sergeant, the wind patterns are unstable. We should calculate manual backups for the firing solutions. Mason didn't even look at him. The computer handles wind. Reeves. That's literally what it does. Just load when I tell you to load. The exercise began at 0630. Battery A fired first, their rounds screaming downrange toward positions 1 and 2. The explosions echoed back seconds later, followed by confirmation. Both targets hit. Battery B, you're up, Torres called over the radio. Position 3, coordinates loaded. Mason checked his ballistic computer, nodded to the gunner. Fire. The howitzer roared, the concussion shaking the ground. Daniel watched the trajectory, his mind automatically calculating the arc. Something felt wrong. The wind had shifted again, a strong gust from the northwest just as they fired. 20 seconds later, Torres's voice crackled over the radio, sharp and angry. Mississippi. You missed by 40 meters. What the hell, Mason? Computer says it was good, sir. Must be a targeting error. There's no targeting error. Fire again. Now, they fired 3 more rounds at position 3. 2 missed. 1 hit the edge, causing minimal damage. The frustration in Mason's voice was palpable as he barked orders, his face reddening with each failed shot. Meanwhile, Battery A had moved to position 4 and hit it on their second attempt. Battery B, you've got 1 target left and you're burning time and ammunition, Hendricks called over the command net. Figure it out or you're done. Battery 1, 2 tanks entering the draw at coordinates Hotel 7. They think they have cover, but you have enfilade from the northeast. Bearing 045, range 1200. Fire when ready. Lieutenant Mitchell. Cease operations immediately. Battery 2, 3 tanks bunched together near the barn at coordinates Golf 4. Prepare for concentration fire on my mark. Down below, the exercise was turning into a slaughter. James could see everything from his perch. Every movement, every tactical decision, every mistake the tank commanders made was visible to him. He directed fire with surgical precision, coordinating 3 different batteries in a deadly ballet that would have been impossible from ground level. The simulated panzers tried to adapt. They scattered, seeking cover in tree lines and behind buildings. But James had studied this terrain for weeks. He knew every depression, every blind spot, every piece of concealment. More importantly, he could see what the individual battery observers on the ground could not, the overall pattern of movement. For minutes had passed. 5 tanks were already marked as destroyed. The remaining 4 were frantically trying to retreat, but James had anticipated that too. Battery 1 and 3, prepare blocking fire on the eastern road. They have nowhere else to go. Coordinates follow. A jeep was racing toward the cattle shed, dust billowing behind it. James could see Colonel Blackwell standing in the passenger seat, his face purple with rage even from this distance. Eddie gripped his shoulder. "Lieutenant, he is coming. We are done." James smiled grimly, never taking his eyes off the valley. "Not yet. Watch this." The remaining 4 tanks made their fatal mistake. Instead of scattering in different directions, they grouped together for mutual support, exactly as German doctrine taught. It was a textbook maneuver that would have worked against conventional observation. But James was not conventional. Battery 2 fire mission. 4 tanks concentrated at coordinates Foxtrot 9. "This is your moment. All guns, fire for effect." The radio crackled with acknowledgement. 6 howitzers spoke as one, their shells screaming across the sky in a coordinated barrage that would have made any artillery officer weep with pride. James had timed it perfectly. The tanks had just entered a shallow depression where they thought they had cover, but from his elevated position, he could see them as clearly as pieces on a chessboard. White smoke erupted across the depression in a devastating pattern. For direct hits, for more destroyed tanks. 9 panzers eliminated in 6 minutes flat. The valley fell silent. Even the angry voices on the radio had stopped. James lowered his binoculars and finally allowed himself to breathe. Beside him, Eddie was staring at the scene below with his mouth open. "Mother of God, I have never seen anything like that." The jeep skidded to a halt at the base of the cattle shed. Colonel Blackwell leaped out before it fully stopped, his face a mask of fury. 2 military police officers followed him. James could hear boots pounding up the wooden stairs. "We are about to get court-martialed," Eddie said quietly. "Maybe, but they saw it work." The door burst open. Colonel Blackwell stood in the entrance, his chest heaving, fists clenched at his sides. Behind him, the MP officers waited for orders to arrest James. For a long moment, nobody spoke. James stood at attention, ready to accept whatever punishment came. Then one of the civilian observers appeared at the top of the stairs, breathing hard from the climb. He was an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He pushed past Blackwell and walked to the window, looking out over the valley where smoke markers still drifted in the morning breeze. "Colonel Blackwell," the man said slowly, his voice carrying authority that made even Blackwell pause. "I need the name of this officer, and I need it now." James felt his stomach drop. This was it. His career was over. But before anyone could speak, the civilian turned from the window, and James saw something unexpected in his expression. It was not anger. It was recognition. If you are watching this story and wondering what happened next, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what this observer said in the next 30 seconds changed everything, not just for James, but for how the United States Army would fight for the rest of the war. The real turning point is just beginning. The civilian observer extended his hand toward James. "General Theodore Hastings, War Department Strategic Operations." That was the most impressive display of coordinated fire I have witnessed since the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918. James shook the hand numbly, barely able to process what was happening. Behind General Hastings, Colonel Blackwell looked like he had swallowed a live grenade. "Sir, this officer directly violated my orders. He commandeered an unauthorized position and disrupted a scheduled exercise without permission. He won the exercise, Blackwell." Hastings turned back to James. "How long have you been developing this technique, Lieutenant?" 3 weeks of observation, sir. But the principles come from ranch work in Montana. Elevated observation allows you to see patterns that ground-level observers miss. You can coordinate multiple units because you understand the complete tactical picture. Hastings nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing through implications. The Germans have been using this exact advantage in North Africa and Italy. Their observers position themselves on high ground and direct fire with devastating accuracy. We have been losing men because our doctrine keeps observers tied to their units at ground level. He turned to Blackwell. "Colonel, how many casualties did the simulated Panzer unit inflict during this exercise?" Blackwell's jaw tightened. "None, sir. They were eliminated before achieving firing positions. And in previous exercises using standard observation methods." Blackwell hesitated. "Approximately 40% casualties among our defensive forces before the enemy was neutralized." Hastings let that number hang in the air. 40%. That meant in a real battle, nearly half the men would die or be wounded because observation doctrine had not adapted to modern warfare. Lieutenant Mitchell, you are either going to be court-martialed or promoted. Possibly both. He smiled grimly. Pack your gear. You are coming to Washington with me tomorrow. The chiefs of staff need to see this. The next 3 months transformed James from a rebellious lieutenant into the architect of a new tactical doctrine. In Washington, he demonstrated his techniques to increasingly senior officers. Some resisted, clinging to traditional methods. Others, especially those who had seen combat, recognized the potential immediately. By December 1944, the first official forward observer towers were being constructed across Europe. They were not elegant structures, just elevated platforms that gave observers the height advantage James had discovered in a Kentucky cattle shed. But they worked. Reports began filtering back from the front lines. Artillery accuracy increased by 60%. Casualty rates among defensive forces dropped dramatically. Tank units that had been decimating Allied positions suddenly found themselves unable to maneuver without being caught in precisely coordinated fire. Hendricks shifted uncomfortably. Sir, his methods seemed unconventional. Unconventional, Price repeated slowly. He faced Daniel again. 2 questions, Private. First, can you teach this technique to others? Yes, sir. Second question. We've got 4 more gun positions at variable ranges up to 5 miles. Can you hit all 4? Daniel's heart pounded. He thought of his grandfather, of every lesson, every calculation, every moment leading to this. Yes, sir. I can. Colonel Price turned to Hendricks. Reconfigure the exercise. For new positions, distances between 3 and 5 miles, random placement. I want to see if this was luck or skill. Within 20 minutes, the range officers had repositioned the targets. Daniel stood at the fire control station, his notebook open, sweat dripping down his face despite the morning hour. Torres stood beside him, while Mason and the rest of battery be waited by the howitzer. Price watched from the observation post, binoculars in hand. Whenever you're ready, Private. Daniel studied the range through the optical sight. The heat shimmer was more pronounced now as the day warmed. He identified his reference points. A cattle fence at 2 miles, an abandoned barn at 3.5, a radio tower at 4.6 miles. Each one told him a story about the wind. First target, 4,200 meters, elevation 287. He worked through the calculations, his pencil moving across the paper with confidence now. Wind analysis showed a complex pattern. Strong crosswind at low altitude, calmer air at peak trajectory, then turbulence near impact. Deflection left 34 mils. Charge 6. The round fired. 28 seconds later, direct hit. Second target 3,800 meters. Daniel adjusted for the slightly shorter range, factored in the changing wind as the morning progressed. Another hit. Third target 5,100 meters, the longest shot of the day. This one required maximum elevation and a precise understanding of how the round would behave at peak altitude where the wind was strongest. Daniel closed his eyes, visualizing the trajectory, feeling for the solution the way his grandfather had taught him. Elevation 401 mils. Deflection right 41 mils. Charge 7. Time fuse 38 seconds. Torres relayed the numbers. The howitzer roared. The round climbed higher than any previous shot, seeming to hang in the air before beginning its descent. Direct hit. The explosion was visible even at 5 miles, a perfect strike. The fourth position was partially obscured by terrain, requiring an indirect approach that would arc the round over a ridgeline. Daniel calculated the high-angle fire solution, accounting for the way gravity would interact with the wind at extreme elevation. His final shot landed within 2 meters of the target center. Colonel Price lowered his binoculars, then turned to his aide. Get me General Morrison at Fort Sill on the phone. We've got something he needs to see. He walked over to where Daniel stood, his uniform soaked with sweat, his hands still trembling from adrenaline. At ease, Private. Price extended his hand. In 30 years of artillery command, I've never seen shooting like that. 4 for 4 at extended range with manual calculations. Thank you, sir. Daniel shook his hand. My grandfather taught me everything. Your grandfather's a smart man. Price turned to Hendricks. Captain, I want Private Reeves assigned to Battalion Fire Control immediately. He's going to develop a training program for manual calculation techniques as a backup to our digital systems. And he's going to teach every artillery crew in this battalion before we deploy. Hendricks snapped a salute. Yes, sir. Mason approached slowly, his earlier hostility replaced with something like respect. That was incredible, Reeves. I was wrong about you. 18 months later, somewhere in Eastern Europe, the winter wind howled across the firebase perimeter. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves stood inside the heated fire control bunker, now wearing the stripes he'd earned through that single extraordinary day at Fort Moore. The deployment had been tense but relatively quiet until 3 days ago, when intelligence detected enemy artillery movements near the border. Now, Battery B and 3 other batteries were positioned in a defensive arc, ready to respond. Captain Hendricks, promoted and commanding the battalion's fire support, entered the bunker. Reeves, we've got a problem. Electronic warfare units just detected jamming signals. Someone's trying to blind our GPS and digital fire control systems. Daniel looked up from his charts. How widespread? All batteries reporting degraded systems. Ballistic computers are giving erratic solutions. We're essentially back to the Stone Age. Hendricks smiled grimly. Good thing we trained for this. Over the next 6 hours, Daniel coordinated manual firing solutions for all 4 batteries. Using the visual observation techniques he'd refined and taught to dozens of crews, they identified enemy positions through traditional spotting methods. The bent nail markers he'd distributed to every gun crew became their primary reference tools. When the enemy artillery opened fire, Battery B responded with devastating accuracy. For enemy gun positions, destroyed within 12 minutes. 0 friendly casualties. The jamming had been meant to paralyze them, but instead, they'd adapted. Colonel Price, now overseeing operations from division headquarters, sent a personal message. Your grandfather would be proud, Reeves. That night, after the engagement, Torres found Daniel outside the bunker, staring at the stars. You saved a lot of lives today, you know that? Daniel nodded slowly. I just did what my grandfather taught me. Trust the fundamentals. Technology fails, but math doesn't. You've changed this whole battalion, man. Everyone respects you now. Everyone wants to learn from you. Daniel thought back to that scorching Georgia morning, to the mockery and the bent nail lying in the dirt, to the moment he'd almost stayed silent. Sometimes the old ways still matter, Torres. We just have to remember why they worked in the first place. 3 months later, Daniel stood in his grandfather's room at the Veterans Care Facility in Columbus, Georgia. The old man's eyes were cloudy with Alzheimer's, but when Daniel pinned his Army Commendation Medal onto the bulletin board beside his grandfather's Vietnam decorations, something flickered in those faded eyes. You taught me everything, Grandpa, Daniel said softly. They laughed at your bent nail, but it saved lives. Your wisdom saved lives. The old colonel smiled, a distant, fragile thing, and for just a moment seemed to recognize his grandson. Outside, the Georgia sun shone warm and bright, and somewhere across the world, artillery crews were hammering bent nails into wooden posts, learning the old ways that would never become obsolete.